Hold on. Let's get them all set up.
Take that down.
Do I say any questions?
Yeah. I say make sound strategic decisions.
So you can hear. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what, whenever anyone asks me that, I say make sound strategic decisions.
Wait, what do you mean?
Oh,
Yeah.
like, if they haven't read anything new, then like I have that on my flow. But
Which team is
Newton's out. That's us. First con.
okay. So Acton last row, your second row.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Okay, for Newton, who's speaking? Your first name? Newton.
Yeah?
Who's speaking first?
J Gard will be speaking first.
What do you say your name?
J-A-Y-G-A-R-G.
J-A-Y-G.
A-R-G.
Okay. And then second.
And Sridhar, A-N-I-K-A.
Okay.
Sridhar,
I don't
S-R-I-D.
know the last names.
That's good.
Sorry, then
Okay.
for Acton, first speaker is Gaurav, G-A-U-R-A-V.
G-A-U-R-A-V.
And second speaker is Anshul, A-N-S-H-U-L.
A-N-S-H-U-L.
Yep.
I always like mad at myself for voting off of work cards.
I mean, like, if I'm voting off cards, everybody lost.
It's true.
Yeah, that's what I tell you. I was like, if there were no evidence disputes in the round, but I'm still calling the cards to the end, means everybody lost. So it should be.
Yeah. It was ridiculous that they called for so many and that took so long.
Grand Cross was like, I've had nightmares about PF rounds that are like what Grand Cross was. Where it's just like, well, 2 paragraphs down, like, well, like, you got the laptops. Like, let's see what you're I'm like, why?
The 2 paragraphs down that even you have in freaking 4-point font.
Would it be okay if I ran to the bathroom for the round started?
Yeah, I went for it.
I'll try my best.
Got mine, bro.
I got it.
I actually really have to go after the shit all of it.
You want to go first?
Nah, you
Everybody should have gone like during a long delay before the round started.
Yeah, we're only like 40 minutes behind. Shout out to finals that's gonna go off at like 12:30.
It's happened before.
Yeah, all my teams better drop the dogs.
Yeah, no. Well,
I'm not, actually, knock on wood, because they'll kill me if they really say that. But yeah,
I mean, you probably want to drop after Octos. No, well, yeah, true. But I mean, with the round robin tomorrow.
Oh, don't talk to me.
Are you staying?
So here's the worst part: is that everybody else is staying for all of tomorrow because they're gonna go see Star Wars tomorrow.
Right.
So I got the worst of both worlds because I am judging the round robin, but I'm leaving before they go to see Star Wars.
Oh, you can come with us tonight.
You go tonight.
Yeah.
people you move over just a little bit.
I'm sending my bus of children over here tonight.
That's what we did. We did last year, and because that was, but then the team that we had that was in finals they both fell asleep. Well, 2 years ago when it was Force Awakens, so they fell asleep in Force Awakens because they just finished up to, like however many rounds that
Yeah, 7 rounds that day.
and then they got up and did the round robin the next day and also so they debated 26 rounds.
Jesus.
3 days.
Yeah, I'm gonna send all the kids except Ellie and Sophia. They're not allowed to have any fun.
What?
It was a joke.
Oh,
I don't. Maybe they have the Rob Robin before.
Oh, okay. I don't know them, so I don't know. I'll chuckle.
The one that Jack just judged.
Oh, okay. I love the Jack Hopper. He's just like fully metamorphosized. Just like he's not even.
What even is?
It's on PF. But we literally brought in somebody else who's coaching the years this weekend. Like, he's just a full-on PF coach.
Okay, what was your question again?
Do you require defensive arguments in the first summary?
I guess I would agree with what the other judge said.
Okay.
Strategic. Okay.
I mean, you guys, yeah, because I told him earlier in the tournament, I don't require defensive arguments in either summary. I can
Okay.
do rebuttal final.
Cool.
So, like, I mean, I guess that means
Does
you
that
shouldn't
go
be.
for you guys as well with second speaking teams?
I'm with him. Like I'm not gonna require it. Like you're not gonna get automatically dropped if you wait till final focus to read it. I'm just saying, like, if it is strategic for you, like, do what makes the most sense in your head.
Yeah, so you have 3 judges with, I guess, different opinions on it, so hedge your bets however you want.
Yeah.
I think is the answer.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Just, like, hedge your bets. That's how it works with your judge panels.
Yeah.
If you want pun, you go for that. Cool.
Oh, and how are judges with speed? Just curious.
I prefer slow.
Okay, that works.
Just because this came up earlier in the tournament. If you have some type of overview argument and it's more than like 20 seconds
There's
long.
such a thing.
Yeah, and it's more than like 20 seconds long. I would personally love it if you told me off time so I can open a new flow sheet. So then I'm not opening flow sheets on the fly.
I like
Okay.
Yeah.
Just tell me where to flow it, like top of their case, top of yours, or on a new sheet. I'll put it somewhere. But if I have to like figure that out on the fly, then that's just words that aren't on my flow.
Along those lines, a lot of people are disguising additional contentions as overviews. So
I love offensive overviews.
Okay, now there's a difference between an offensive overview and I'm gonna read a new contention for a minute and second rebuttal.
RG jump.
Yeah. Trademark. Alright, let's do it.
Okay. Everybody set? Yeah.
Yep.
Judges?
Yeah.
Anika?
Ready?
Cool. We negate. Contention 1 is economic collapse. Subpoint A concerns a split with the European Union. Secession would tank Catalonia's economy because it would no longer be a part of the EU. BBC 17 reports that the EU would never support Catalan independence because it would encourage secession throughout the EU. Thus, under EU law, Catalonia would be booted from the organization. Stotthard 17 of FT writes that this would be catastrophic because all of a sudden all of Catalonia's trade with the EU, which compromises 75% of its trade, would be subject to export tariffs. He concludes that the Catalan GDP would drop by 30% and unemployment would double. Subpoint B is antagonizing Spain. Gemawat continues that when the surplus is forced to cross a national border, trade would decrease by 2/3. Furthermore, Bosch 17 of CNBC finds that as a result of being given independence, you would likely see a boycott on Catalan products from Spain due to lingering tensions, which would also decrease trade. Overall, Reinert 16 of the University of Leuven studies all newly independent countries between 1950 and 2013 and finds that the decision to secede reduces the per capita GDP of the seceding nation by 20 to 46% in the long run. Contention 2 is unbalancing Spain. Spain granting Catalonia independence increases the probability of civil war within Spain in 2 ways. First, by appearing weak. After analyzing 60 years of data on ethnic groups, Walter 06 of the IO Foundation empirically finds that when the government grants one faction independence, other factions become more likely to instigate violent conflict to gain their own independence. In the Catalan case, this could mean violent uprisings from the Basques, who have a history of violence, the Galicians, or any other Spanish ethnic group, Galicians. Second, by quashing diversity. Catalonia is a diverse, unique part of Spain. It has its own language, food, culture. Thus, Bonet 17 of the Conversation finds that the Spanish population would be far more homogeneous without Catalonia. This would be devastating, as diversity is the key to stability. In diverse states, everyone feels that their voice is being heard, whereas in homogeneous states, politicians are able to cater only to the interests of one party, excluding minorities. Street 08 of Holy Cross thus analyzes 229 countries across a 24-year time period and finds that a 1-unit increase reduction in ethnic diversity leads to a 68% increase in terrorism. She furthers that diverse societies are far less likely to have civil war. Contention 3 is violent conflict. We see violent conflict with secession in 3 ways. First, through creating more armies. Siraki 09 of Duke University finds that ethnic tensions are not resolved by secession. Instead, because each group is now a country, those tensions quickly escalate into an interstate conflict. Indeed, Waterman 96 of the University of Haifa explains that separation magnifies conflict by providing each cultural group with a separate army and a separate set of alliances. Indeed, establishing a military was described by the president of Catalonia as, quote, absolutely indispensable, end quote. Overall, Siraki continues that a majority of new states become involved in militarized interstate disputes with their parent state after secession due to these unresolved ethnic tensions. Second, creating a cycle of secession. Siraki 09 of Duke finds that once you open the Pandora's box of secession, it's extremely hard to close it again. Thus, he furthers that nations that secede often have new minority groups within themselves who get emboldened by the success of the former secession. He concludes that 66% of states created through secession experience a new violent secession within 25 years of leaving, and 63% experienced violent ethnic riots within 10 years of leaving. In the case of Catalonia, Bergen 12 of The Guardian finds that Eastern European minorities make up 12% of the population. Third, collapse. Aladdin 15 of the London School of Economics finds that Catalonia has been so focused on achieving secession that they haven't focused on what comes next, devoid of a plan to organize security institutions or economic institutions. Unfortunately, when nations don't have strong or capable governments, civil war is prone to ensue. Thus, Siraki continues that a new nation experiences civil war almost half of the time after secession. Overall, Siraki finds that some form of conflict ensues in 90% of secessions. Thus, Anika and I are extremely proud to negate. Ready for cross?
He's in the case.
Yeah, good point. It's going to be a very fun cross. Okay.
Alright, opponents ready?
Yep.
All three judges and Ansho. Alright, let's begin. Acton Boxborough affirms the resolution and contention 1 is refugees. Spain is currently dragging its feet on fulfilling its commitment to housing refugees. Wilson of The Independent explains that while 17,000 refugees were planned to be relocated to Spain, the Spanish government has only accepted 6% of them. Hoffman of Vice explains that continual political resistance has prevented the Spanish government from taking in more refugees. Problematically, Hoffman continues that the only entity legally capable of authorizing the intake of refugees in the status quo is the Spanish federal government. However, granting Catalonia independence would provide refugees on the border with a new home. Unlike the Spanish government, Catalonia is ideologically committed to helping refugees. Barton of NYU finds that almost 1 million Catalan residents are descendants of refugees from Madrid or other European provinces. In this vein, Palmer of the University of Barcelona explains that Catalonia's refugee history is present in the memories of both older and younger generations. For this reason, Palmer explains that the Catalan government is ready to take in refugees as soon as they are given the opportunity to do so. Bellware of the Huffington Post corroborates that there is a consensus among Catalans that the government should accept substantially more refugees. As such, according to the Tasnim news agency, Catalan politicians have explicitly stated that more refugees would be taken in if Catalonia were to gain independence. Already, the Al Monitor reports that Catalonia has the public services and infrastructure ready to house refugees. Hoffman furthers that Catalonia can use municipal funds for refugee provisions like social and housing programs. Put simply, an independent Catalonia would be free from the constraints that hamper the Spanish government's ability to accept refugees. The impact is preventing mass suffering. For a refugee, the alternative to relocation is staying in refugee camps. Because refugee camps are consistently under-resourced and located in conflict zones, Smith of the USCRI explains that refugees are typically housed in the most desolate and dangerous settings. For this reason, Malmstrom of the European Commission finds that resettlement can mean the difference between life and death for refugees. Contention 2 is preventing conflict escalation. Compromise is not on the horizon. As pro-unity demonstrators and pro-independence separatists come to a head, Jones of The Guardian explains that current tensions between Catalonia and Spain are at an all-time high. Wildman of Vox explains that this has left Catalonia in a state of political and economic instability. Problematically, Kingsley of the New York Times explains that failure for Catalonia and Spain to reach a viable solution will only embolden radical separatists in other countries who will believe that peaceful negotiations with the host state are fruitless. In this vein, Catalonia and Spain will continue to escalate for 2 reasons. The first is radical parties. According to Buck of the Financial Times, without support of smaller, more radical groups, separatists do not have a majority in Catalonia's majority party. This gives these radical groups undue leverage over the independence movement, which they use to push for a more hardline and confrontational approach. Second is a domestic crackdown. In an attempt to stop Catalan independence, Guyon of The Guardian reports that the Spanish government has reacted with aggression. This ensures escalation, as Balcells of Duke finds that self-determination movements empirically respond to repressive actions by the host state with violence. Indeed, Ottens of the Foreign Policy Research Institute explains that the curtailing of Catalan autonomy has only radicalized the movement for independence. For these 2 reasons, Saez of DW explains that the Catalan secessionist movement and the Spanish anti-independence movement are now ideologically irreconcilable. Without a solution, Roller of the London School of Economics explains that the conflict will only escalate further. Already, Newton of Al Jazeera reports that there has been a recent upsurge in violence from Spanish nationalists against Catalan independence supporters. Fortunately, affirming ends this cycle. Fernando Betancourt explains that recognizing Catalan independence would kickstart negotiations over issues such as debt, property, and social services, allowing for a gradual secession process. Indeed, Hedgeko of the Irish Times explains that if Spain were to recognize Catalan independence, it would be part of an amicable agreement in which EU rights are maintained. Overall, Colonna of the Leiden University writes that the process of bilateral secession generally concludes on peaceful terms. Thus, we affirm.
Before cross,
Sure.
can I see increased violence from Spanish nationalists?
Which card?
I don't remember the name, just the one
That's a
that's
good question, man.
The one that just said, like, Spain is getting, like, Spanish nationalists are attacking Catalan.
And can I see Palmer says that the Catalonia is ready to take on refugees if they get the opportunity?
Okay.
And we'll take that right now.
Okay. First card is that they want to take in refugees.
Okay, starting.
Grab it now.
Minority, 7 seconds.
And then the next one was violence from.
Spanish nationalists.
Oh, okay, that's in Newton.
That's from what?
Newton. And they're Newton South. The evidence is Newton.
Oh.
That's really bad, girl.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Sometimes right now. That's so cool.
26 seconds. Cool. And I am ready for crossing the beer.
Yeah. Alright, is everyone ready?
Do you mind if I ask the first question?
Go for
Awesome. So does the EU keep Catalonia in or kick it out?
What?
Does the EU allow Catalonia to remain in?
I'd say they allowed it.
Okay, cool. Do you have a question for me?
Okay, let's talk about your second contention about like this like civil war. So your second warrant, you tell me that like when you have like different cultures in a society, they're less likely to have civil war, but when they're separated, it's more likely to have this kind of sort of war break out, right?
Yes.
So because Catalan people eat different food, does Spain want to go to civil war with them?
No. So the problem is the ethnic tensions that you talk about in your second contention. Right
Sure.
now, Catalans are really mad at Spain because they've been being oppressed.
Sure.
And Spain is really mad at Catalonia because
Sure.
this whole incident is being blown out of proportion.
Sure.
But right now, in the status quo, you're not seeing violence because Catalonia doesn't have an
I just
army.
showed you a
They
card that
can't
said-
secede. Well, actually, your
Okay,
card
so
says your
Catalonia
card-
doesn't have an army, so they're not going to have this like sort of
a
conflict happen.
violent secession, sure. But when they
Okay.
secede, they're a nation, they have their own army, and now you have two ethnic states that don't like each other because
Okay,
they have
how
a ton
long
of
does
bad
it take
history,
for
which
Catalonia
when they
to
attack.
develop an army?
Probably a long time.
A long time. Okay,
Sure.
cool.
And then they attack. That's why Siraki tells
Alright.
you that
Wait,
90%
wait.
of cases
Don't
see
you
violence
think,
within 50
Jay,
years.
Jay, just think about the time frame of this argument, right? Because it's
Sure.
a little ridiculous, right? I would argue that in the meantime, before like Catalonia has the ability to build up this sort of army to go to war with Spain, I would argue in that meantime it's mutually beneficial for both Spain and Catalonia to have a peaceful transition.
Grav, I think
Right.
we've seen a lot of different instances of where having secession
That
or
are
having
very
two different
different from
nations.
Spain and Catalonia.
No, but we've seen a lot of instances, like, obviously they're not the same thing, but India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, right?
They're definitely
When you have
not
two
the
states-
same thing.
They're not the same thing. But when you have two states that are very ethnically different and that have a terrible
Cool.
history with each other of this oppression, that's
I would
when you
argue
see
that the
arming them is a bad idea.
wait, Jack.
Grav,
I
can
would
ask you a
argue that
question,
the history of oppression between these two actors is very, very different from like an India and a Pakistan
sure.
and an Israel and a Palestine. I would argue that doesn't get you the link to this idea of a conflict happening. But you can ask me your question.
though? Great. So in your second contention, you talk about this conflict escalation, right?
Yes, I do.
So can you give me a single instance of Catalan citizens reacting violently?
What?
Catalan citizens reacting violently? Because your
Yeah,
entire
during the
contention-
protests.
No, That piece of evidence
Like
you showed
during
me
the referendum
said-
when
wait,
those like injuries
Rob,
happened, like the 900 injuries that happened.
Those were
right?
the Spanish police to the Catalan citizens.
Yes, exactly.
And-
I'm saying that they
Yeah.
responded there too.
How many people were injured?
I
How
don't-
much response was there? 'Cause there
900
really
people,
wasn't.
900 Catalan people were injured.
Yes, exactly. Catalan people are being injured, but the point of this contention is that Catalan citizens are going to start fighting back with violence.
Yes.
And we haven't seen
So wait,
any
more-
Catalan violence.
Wait,
in
wait,
Spain.
wait. What do you mean?
Show me an instance of where Catalan
I said there was
citizens
violence that
have
happened
acted
during the
violently.
referendum.
Yes, from Spain to Catalonia.
Okay.
Where
Wait,
was
wait,
the Catalonia to
Wait,
Spain
Jay,
violence
wait,
that you're
wait,
talking
Jay.
about?
Backtrack a little bit. If Catalonia is not responding with violence right now,
Yeah.
why would they respond with violence and building an army when with this like civil war that you
Because
talk
right now
about?
they don't have a military, they have no way to back up their
Okay,
threats.
but you
They are
literally
alone.
told me that Catalan
Rob.
people don't want to go into conflict with
Rob.
Spain.
No, right now they don't have the opportunity to.
Jay,
They're-
you're making like a
Rob,
lot of contradictions
Rob,
right now.
Can you first just answer the first question? Have
What
we
is the
seen
question?
any Catalan violence to Spain?
I said it happened during the injuries, but since then, the injuries during the referendum.
But we're going to starting now.
These Catalan people don't want to go into conflict. Like Spain, and just I would read that on their second extension. It's like cycle of secession.
Alright,
35 seconds.
My opponent's ready?
Yeah.
Sorry. Stabilize. Partner, all three of my judges? Great. Let's begin. Start off on their first contention about refugees. Essentially, they tell you that Catalonia really likes refugees, but Spain doesn't. And when you make Catalonia independent, they're going to take in refugees. A couple of problems. First of all, their piece of evidence literally says that some politicians in government like refugees. I'd argue that that's probably not the vast majority. But second of all, either way, the economy is a prerequisite to being able to take in refugees for the first place. Meaning that if we win our first contention on the economy, we ultimately win this impact. Because if you have a poor economy, you're in a double line. Either you can't take in refugees, or you take in refugees and their quality of life is really, really, really poor, and they only live in other refugee camps. But third of all, either way, conflict is a prerequisite to refugees because conflict breeds refugees. Meaning that if we win our third contention, we also link into this. But third of all, either way, Studbaker 17 finds that the left-wing party within Spain is currently the minority. However, it had managed to pass liberal policies with the support of Catalan swing votes. Meaning that if you want these liberal policies within Catalonia, you vote for us. You don't make Catalonia secede because at that point, Spain is going to at least vote a little bit liberally and potentially pass this policy on refugees. Go on to their second contention. They tell you that there are really, really high tensions in the status quo, and that Catalonia, this is going to link into conflict for a couple of reasons. The first thing they tell you is that radical people are going to push for the independence. They're going to push for the Independence Party to get more radical. A couple of problems. First of all, across the point, my last response, Studbaker tells you that left-wing parties within left-wing within Spain is a minority. So if they want to pass liberal policies, they need Catalonia. But second of all, make them show you what conflict is happening in the status quo. There is literally no conflict in the status quo. I'd argue. There's no conflict in the status quo. I'd argue that it's probably not important. That's really important because Catalonia literally cannot attack Spain without a military. Meaning that if we win, that they build up a military, they're going to have an incentive to attack. But third of all, in the end of the day, what's happening in the status quo is very different from what they say. Because Catalan news reports that independence parties are negotiating right now, and the reason for that, because we agree that they want to attack and that they have these high ethnic tensions, but they cannot do so if they're going to face retaliation from the Spanish military. At that point, they're really disincentivized to attack. So you turn the argument because negotiations go away in their world. Then their second link talks about this aggression from Spain. A couple of things. First of all, every single piece of evidence about violence that they read to you comes from Spain being aggressive towards Catalonia. There's not a single piece of evidence from Catalonia being aggressive towards Spain. Why? Because they feel retaliation. But second of all, this violence from Spain is going to stop in the long term. Because Joan 17 of The Guardian finds that Spain apologized for being violent during the referendum. All their evidence comes from violence during the referendum. It's not like from a long period of time. It's not like this violence has continued. Spain doesn't want to be violent anymore. But third of all, the violence has been going down. Make them give you a single piece of evidence that tells you that this violence is going to continue in the real world. But then finally, at the end of the day, look at their impact because it's on repression. On repression. Recognize they don't prove to you that in the status quo we haven't reached the brink of repression. They don't prove to you that we've reached so much that we're going to link into conflict. That's really important because if they read you all these pieces of evidence telling you that Catalonia wants to be independent, and they want to retaliate against Spain, yet Catalonia has literally done nothing. I'd argue that it's really, really not probable because Catalonia is not ready to attack. But at the end of the day, what he concedes to you in First Crossfire is really important because he tells you that right now, what's been happening is Catalonia is going to stay in the EU. That has a couple of implications. First of all, go to our first contention, because we tell you that when Catalonia is in the EU, Catalonia is in the EU, that's really, really good for their for the economy, because now they're going to be able to get trading benefits. But second of all, what the name in 15 of Lederman University Fund, that if the EU lets Catalonia become a member after seceding, all European regions considering seceding would concede EU membership as guaranteed. That's really, really important because the probability of other European regions fighting for independence would skyrocket. Consequently, you should give general secession, good or bad cards, far more weight than Catalonia-specific cards, because you're going to be seeing a secession on a far larger scale, meaning that you automatically vote for us.
Alright. We're on prep time starting now.
Oh, pause prep. Did we see the left wing thing?
Yep.
The middle passage here. Can you just highlight it?
No, the one with the highlighter.
Oops.
Yeah. Just say that like most of the just for case of response in there.
There's some type mention.
So they don't none of the evidence literally says that any of these countries are going to
It's not this way.
Are you guys still on prep?
No.
No. Oh, one second, really quick.
Is everyone ready? Actually, I just need a couple things. Okay, I'm going to be starting on their responses to our case and then straight down the case. Everyone ready? Great. Let's start with their responses on our first contention about refugees. At the top, their first response says that our evidence only talks about some politicians. Two responses here. First, the Bellerin evidence says that the Catalonian government actually really wants to take in refugees. Specific political parties that are dominating within the government are the ones who are saying they want refugees. But second of all, at the point where the Hoffman evidence says that they're literally building the infrastructure as we speak to accept these refugees, it's pretty clear that they want to take in refugees. Their second response is that econ prereqs. I have three responses here. Number one, what Nagel of the ANU explains is that an independent Catalonia is going to be economically stable stable because they can still trade with other countries. This is really important because Anika concedes in her last rebuttal that Catalonia is going to be accepted as part of the EU, and then she said that that's going to be really good for their economy. She literally concedes that when she goes on to her case at the end of our rebuttal. At that point, they're not going to pre-rep their econ. But second of all, I would argue that even if this econ harms actually happen, Catalonia would just want to take in more refugees because they see refugee inflows as a really good source of economic growth and a way to plug the labor gap. Their final response here was that left-wing parties in Catalonia have a minority votes in Spain, and that's the only chance of passing pro-refugee policies. I call for the evidence. There's zero link to actual. It doesn't talk about refugees whatsoever. I would say at the point where the Hoffman evidence says that political resistance and gridlock within the Spanish government is always going to prevent refugee policies from ever being passed. They don't have any probability of left-wing people in the Spanish government being able to access this sort of probability on refugee policy. Then on their turns on our second contention, most of them are just cross-outs from our case, so I'll get to that later on their case. With that in mind, let's get to their first contention about economic collapse. Their first argument here is about a split with the EU, but then Anika concedes in her last rebuttal that Catalonia is going to stay as part of the EU, and then she says that that's really good for their economy, so I'm not going to waste too much time here. But either way, let's go to their second warrant here on antagonizing Spain. Recognize that amicable separation isn't actually going to lead to a reduction in trade between the two countries. Both countries would realize that trading with each other is in their economic best interest and aren't short-sighted enough to let ideological nationalism get in the way of that. For this reason, the Barcelona Chamber of Commerce finds that an amicable independence process isn't going to actually negatively impact trade between the two countries. Let's go to their contention 2 about unbalancing Spain and increasing the probability of civil war. Their first link here is appearing weak, and they say that other groups are going to rise up, but they don't really give you any warrant as to why they're going to be violent within Spain. In fact, I would turn this argument against them, because if anything, other independence movements within Spain are just going to pursue peaceful negotiations in the same exact way that Catalonia did, because now they know it's effective. If anything, the precedent of granting Catalonia independence is going to legitimize peaceful negotiation process as a really good way to get more autonomy for these regions. If anything, they're not going to turn towards violent means, they're going to turn towards non-violent means. Let's go to their second warrant here about quashing diversity. First of all, this is really vague. None of their impact evidence is actually unique to Catalonia. In fact, that's a problem with pretty much every other card that they read in the rest of this case. But still, there are really diverse regions in Spain. People in Basque are very different from people in Madrid, who are very different from people in the Canary Islands. I would say that cultural differences in Catalonia are way more different than the types of ethnic conflicts that actually lead to sparking out civil war. But then let's go to the contention 3 about violent conflict. Their first link here is about developing an army. Number 1, what Garov tells you in Crossfire is that it takes a very, very long time to ever build up an army. At the point where they don't prove any sort of incentive for the Catalonian government to actually develop and invest in a very strong army, they'll actually create the incentive for them to challenge Spain militarily. It's very unlikely that this happens. But second of all, if Catalonians don't actually want to go to war, nothing actually happens. They prove no link whatsoever within their case other than cultural differences that Catalonia would ever want to go to war with Spain. Insofar as they can see that Spain isn't going to instigate the conflict and Catalonia won't either, because they're just eat different food and speak a slightly different language, war isn't going to happen. Let's go to their final argument about legitimizing secession. Recognize number 1, this is non-unique. There's no reason why Catalonian independence uniquely legitimizes secessions. A, there have been plenty of other successful secession movements like Kosovo, but B, it would have been triggered by the referendum. But second, you can turn it, because independence movements are relatively strong in both worlds, but the AF is the only team that prevents them from escalating into violence. King Leo of the New York Times explains, the lack of a viable solution to the Catalan independence crisis will embolden radical separatists in other countries who believe that peaceful negotiations are fruitless. Only the AF reform state in the negotiating process as a really good way to resolve secession conflicts. But third, you can turn it against them because Spanish recognition of Catalan independence pushes these secession movements into mainstream politics.
Ready for class?
Yeah.
Is everybody ready? So let's talk about one of the responses you made to my third contention. You tell me that we don't prove that Catalans have an incentive to go to conflict with Spain, right?
Yeah.
Don't you tell me in your second contention all these reasons why Catalonia is really mad and the conflict is about to escalate.
Yeah, those are things that go away when you grant it.
Why? Wait, why do the tensions go away?
Because the Spanish government is no longer dominating politically.
Wait, but that's not, hold on,
Catalonia.
that's not what your argument said. Your argument, and what's really explicit, is the reason that people are mad in Catalonia is because they watched on their TV as bleeding women died as they went to vote. That incentive and that anger doesn't go away just because you're separate countries.
Okay, you yourself told me in your rebuttal, first response, you delinked our contention, saying that all of our evidence was just talking about Spain wanting to escalate, but not talking about Catalonia.
No.
That's pretty true.
No.
It's a badly written contention.
I never talked about the incentive. I said, No. Anshul, let me finish.
Right.
I never talked about the incentive. I said, yeah, Catalonia, your evidence all talked about Spain actually attacking, but Catalonia never attacked. That's really important because I conceded, I agree. Catalonia still is really angry and they have an incentive to attack. The only difference
What is their incentive to attack? Just because they're angry at
yeah,
Spain?
they're very angry, but they can't attack.
About what?
Spain like hit so many people on the streets. 900 were injured. They were taking
How
their
many went
rights.
to the hospital?
I don't know.
2. And those were just bruises. Like, honestly, like, what has happened?
Also, first of all, there were videos of bleeding women on the street. Second
Okay,
of all,
I
Spain is
understand,
vetoing
okay.
a lot of like Catalan policy.
I understand that is true, but the reason why that violence happened, and you tell me this in your rebuttal, was
Yeah.
because there was a referendum going on, and because they were thinking about the
Sure.
independence movement. When you resolve that crisis, when you grant
Sure.
Catalonia independence, that sort of conflict doesn't happen.
But that's-
they don't see police brutalizing protesters on the
Sure.
street anymore.
Sure.
It doesn't happen, and they don't have an incentive to go to war.
I agree, Anshul. I agree that maybe there's like no more like future escalation of the conflict. The problem is you don't just forget things out like that, right? It's not like you just like
I understand that,
Like, all
but
of
at
a
the
sudden
same
go away.
time, okay, of course you remember things that are bad. You remember that police brutality occurred and you condemn it.
Right.
But that does not tell me that you're changing the fundamental political rationality within the Catalan government to actually pursue a war strategy. That's probably going to be devastating.
You're the one who tells me that people within the Catalan government are so radical that they want to push for violence. That's literally your second contention.
That is not our argument. We're not saying that the dominant Catalan government is the one that's
But
pursuing
you say
violence.
the people who are going to get into the I never
No, you
contested
say there are
that
a
these
couple
radicals
isolated terrorist attacks from
Wait.
Spanish nationalists against Catalans,
no,
but not the other way
that's
around.
not what your evidence says. Your evidence tells me.
Anika, this is what we read in case.
No,
You were
that's
right
what
when
your
you pointed
evidence
out that our evidence is about Spain pursuing violence.
I agree.
It's not about Catalonia
No,
pursuing
I agree.
violence.
Catalonia is not going to pursue violence, but the incentive doesn't go away because
You
your
just,
evidence.
wait, what do you mean you
let me
agree
finish.
they're not going to pursue violence, but the incentive doesn't go away?
Because they want to pursue violence, but without a military, they can't pursue it. They
Okay.
have an incentive
So
right
do you
now
have-
to
so
be
do you have-
violent.
do
They
you
don't
have
have
any
the
evidence-
means to be
Anika,
violent.
Quickly, do you have any evidence that you read within your case saying that the dominant political party within Catalonia, as soon as they're going to be independent, will pursue war?
I have one to build up a military,
Okay.
and a lot of people say that when you build up a military, you go to war.
Starting prep now.
Everyone prep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there's war secession, it's involved. We don't want to just
It's performance art about average.
And that's actually
It's like
when you restore faith in
Hold that brief follow.
they don't really pursue violence. And that also turns into potential to enter Spain. Basque region, for example, also will turn to mainstream elite grounds because they see the negotiation process as something that works. So extend that to those, like extend that term and apply it to those, I think, and their contentions. Wait, was that in a place like civil war, like in a place where needs within Spain, there was also interstate conflicts.
Yeah.
2 minutes used. So that's 235 overall. Oh, no. 2 plus 26 plus 3.
It's so interesting. I just look at these. We beat them around 6 Italians.
Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Start off on this point about refugees. Keep in mind, first, the Studbaker turn that they completely mishandled tells you that the left-wing party in the left-wing Catalan vote is the only reason why in the status quo Spain is accepting refugees, because that's the only way that the left-wing party is being able to pass policy. Otherwise, you have a right-wing majority. At that point, what you see in their world is that the left-wing party leaves Spain, so Spain doesn't accept any more refugees. That's a direct turn. But second, keep in mind, they never respond to the fact that conflict prereqs their impact. Anika says that in rebuttal because conflict creates way more refugees than be handled when Catalonia starts accepting them. At that point, you're going to see that conflict is the most important voting issue in today's round. conflict is a reason to be voting neg in today's round because of the Van Namen turn that Anika says at the end of her rebuttal that they completely drop. What Van Namen says is that right now in other countries there are secessionist movements that are pretty powerful. The only thing holding them back is the fear that the EU is going to kick them out and their economy is really going to suffer. At that point, when they tell you that the EU is not going to kick them out, Van Namen says that other secession movements get emboldened to finally secede. They completely drop that in today's round. That is why general secession impacts are much more important than Catalonia, because it's just going to happen in far more countries. At that point, Siraki tells you that because newly seceded nations most of the time don't have proper institutions for handling things, you see that 50% of the time there's civil war in those new countries because they can't help their civilians. And second, Waterman tells you that when you have these secessions that don't go so well, that because of ethnic tensions and because of like oppression in the past, you see that when they get armies, they just turn around and attack the country they just seceded from, which is why Siraki overall concludes that in 90% of secessions, you have violent conflict within 50 years of seceding. At that point, our case outweighs theirs in a couple of ways. First, because it's a direct prerequisite into their impact about refugees. If you have more conflict, you're going to see that the impact gets far, far worse, and they never respond to that. Second, on scope, because while they're only talking about the Catalan, the Catalan secession right now, we're talking about a secession movement all over Europe that right now have a majority in their legislative bodies, but aren't doing it because of this EU thing. When you break that barrier, that is when you finally see you're affecting far more people than in their world. And finally, on magnitude, because conflict, killing people, having people die in a war is by far the most big impact in today's round. Strong finish.
Right around crowd, yeah.
Good way.
Is everyone ready? I'm going to start on our first contention, then go to their case. Okay. The easiest place to vote in today's round is going to be off of our first contention on refugees. What we tell you with the Wilson evidence is that 17,000 refugees were supposed to be relocated to Spain, but only 6% of them were accepted. The reason for this is the Hoffman evidence tells you that political resistance has prevented Spain from taking in more refugees, which is bad because Spain is the only actor legally capable of taking in refugees, so Catalonia can't do it by themselves. They make a couple of responses that they send through the summary. The first thing is this thing about left wings, but realize two problems. A, it doesn't talk about refugees, but B, our argument is not that Spain takes in these refugees, it's that Catalonia takes in these refugees. It's not a problem of like the right wing in Spain. We're saying it's the Catalonian problem. But then the second and most important thing they try to respond to is by saying that like conflict is like a prerequisite to this. The problem with this argument is time frame, because they themselves tell you that like this conflict is very, very long term and it's really, really far off because they have to do things like building armies. We're telling you that Catalonia can accept these refugees right away. They do not prereq our impact. What we tell you with the Tansim News Agency is that Catalan politicians have said more refugees would be taken in with independence, and the all-monitory evidence tells you that Catalonia has the infrastructure to take in refugees right now. We tell you this prevents mass suffering right now in the short term, which you should prefer, because their impacts are very, very long term. We tell you the amount of evidence is that resettlement is the difference between life and death for these refugees. Weigh this over conflict in two ways. Number one is probability, because the probability of conflict that they talk about is really, really low, because they talk about all these like ridiculous like conflicts that could possibly happen. But second is time frame, because their conflict is really, really long term. We say help refugees right away. Let's go to conflict. The first thing that you can vote off of is like let's talk about this like turn from like Van Namen. Realize that like we can still respond to this. They read it in rebuttal. I'm giving my summary right now. What Mancini of the University of Bologna argues is that demonizing secession and turning it into a constitutional taboo adds fuel to these movements. However, if secession was subject to legal and rational jurisdiction by the EU, it would lose its evocative power and thus prompt independence movements to shift their agendas to less disruptive objectives. This is the only long-term solution for these secessionist movements, because we both tell you that these secessionist movements exist, but we're telling you that in our world, there's actually a legal avenue for these secessionist movements to get actual changes to happen, and they don't need to turn to things like violent means that both sides agree are so bad. At the end of the day, the problem isn't being solved in their world. We say there's at least a chance it gets solved in ours.
Great. You guys ready for cross?
Yes.
Do you mind?
I was like moving this thing.
You got the first question, Jay.
Cool. So you told me that Spain is taking in refugees right now, right?
Only a little bit.
Oh, Spain.
6%, right?
They take in 6% of the 17,000 they're supposed to be taking in.
Okay.
But like the Hoffman evidence is pretty
Re-
explicit in
regardless,
saying
wait.
that Spain is not going to
Wait.
take in more. Like political resistance within Spain.
If they
That's
were to
awful.
take in more, where does this political resistance come from?
What?
Where does the political resistance come from?
Factionalization within the Spanish government. I mean, it's
From
like
who? But like, what is the
Constituents,
resistance?
people in the government too,
What
because they don't
party
want you like
specifically?
their constituents
What
really
party?
do not want refugees to come in.
What party?
I don't know
I don't-
specific
it's
political
like-
party.
like
The
the
Rajoy's
People's-
party
In
too.
People's
Spain,
Party?
right now,
The People's Party. Yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
People's Party.
Rajoy-
In Spain, right now, the People's Party is really anti-refugee. What the Studebaker evidence is really explicit about saying is that the only way to change that, the only way to empower the left wing to pass their policies is by keeping Catalonia
Jay,
in
here's
refugees
the
because
big
they
problem
provide
with
this
this
part.
right? Like,
At that point, you
here's the
see
problem.
more refugees
Yeah.
coming
Like
in.
that like left wing argument that you're talking about is supposed to be happening in the status quo, but it's very clear.
No, it's
No.
not about happening in the status quo, right?
It
It's,
says-
it's about
It's happening
potentially
what,
in
like,
the future.
So maybe
right?
in the future, right?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Maybe we can cross our fingers and hope that maybe in the future the left wing is suddenly going to take over the Spanish parliament and allow
Guys.
refugees in. But the point that with the Hoffman evidence is pretty explicit in saying that right now it is
Guys.
so gridlocked that refugees are never going to be let in. I don't think that's
And
a
in
risk
our
we
world,
should
we're
take.
saying that because we already have
Guys.
the infrastructure in Catalonia, you guarantee that these refugees get a home. There's only a chance in your world.
That's okay. Two problems with that. First off, you never prove that all of these refugees are going to come in.
Yeah.
Second off, like you just.
I would say that a vast majority of them want to come in. They already have the
that.
infrastructure to come in.
You have infrastructure to handle refugees. You don't have infrastructure to
17,000.
handle 17,000.
Yes, they do. I
Right?
mean, like-
there's a
Wait,
difference.
hold on.
between the
Wait,
two.
yeah.
But
There's
yeah,
a
wait.
big problem. And
First of
second
all, this is
wait.
pretty late to respond to the
No,
argument.
this is a
too.
response we've been making, yeah. And moreover, like, you guys tell me that, like, they need to, like, build up, they're still going to have to build up, like, a military. They're still going to have to, like, reform their, like, economy and all
You
this
don't
stuff.
read any evidence in the round that says that they're actually going to build up a military.
Yes, we do. That was
read
we
the
know.
evidence
No, I mean, like,
from
either
the,
way, it wasn't in summary either.
That's fair.
That's yeah.
You have a question for us.
Yeah, let's talk about conflict.
Let's.
Where is conflict going to happen?
Flanders, Corsica, Bavaria.
Flanders is so
the
peaceful.
Faroe Islands. No,
Flanders
so,
is so peaceful.
so what we're
I've
telling
been there before.
Venice,
so
No
you
one is
know.
angry.
Venice is the
No,
one.
they're pretty
I've
angry.
been to Catalonia, no one was angry. It's a really nice, chill Mediterranean.
Yeah, and I don't
So
think
you
they're
really
gonna
have
go to war either.
anymore.
Yeah.
But guys, what you're seeing in the status quo is that those movements that I just mentioned, every single one of them has a pro-independence majority
But do
in
they?
their
But
parliament.
do, wait.
Right,
But do
the
those?
reason
Wait,
it
Jay,
hasn't happened,
really
guys.
quickly. Do those pro-independence movements want to go to conflict?
Yes,
Yes,
they want
they do.
independence. But the
But so
thing-
why aren't they doing it now?
Because of the
they're-
EU thing. That's
they're
the
waiting
main
for the
evidence.
EU precedent.
It's
That's the
really-
evidence explicitly
the-
says. They're
guys,
waiting to
okay,
see what
the
happens.
barrier, guys, it's really, really clear. The barrier to seceding is you're worried your economy is going to tank and no one is going to bail you out. But Van Naaman tells you that when you provide the precedent that the EU lets someone in, they think that's going to apply to them as well, which is why you really, really encourage
Okay,
secession, which is
The
far worse.
Mancini
in
evidence
the
says
long
that
term.
it just turns them towards mainstream politics.
But that's not happening in the status quo.
Yes, that's the point.
We're not the rest of our prep time starting now.
Cool.
So, the Wang is number one probability. Okay? Yeah. And then second is time frame, like right away. And then third is just clarity, right? Because they can't tell you what kind of conflict is going to happen, where that conflict is going to happen, how bad that conflict is going to be. We tell you very clearly, like, I'm pissed by the second two rounds of that. Like, stop them from being on the brink of survival. They want. So, they don't tell you. They don't tell you what the very conflict is, how bad it's going to be.
My opponent's ready. My partner ready.
Yeah.
Most importantly, my judges. on this really silly point about refugees, recognize one, conflict is absolutely a prerequisite, because even if conflict happens in the long term, it still breeds more and more refugees, meaning that you have more refugees in the long term, even if it's not right now. And moreover, if Spain is never going to take in refugees, if you have a conflict within Spain and Catalonia, Spain is going to have even more refugees that they're just going to oppress even more. At that point, conflict is always going to come before refugees. But second of all, they never actually proved to you that they need the brink of this. They never actually proved to you that they have enough infrastructure for Catalonia to take in all these refugees. It's really glibly and not a way to vote. But the clear way to vote is going to be on conflict. In second summary, they read you this really silly turn about making this conflict mainstream. However, they don't necessarily respond to the fact that these countries have a majority in these legislative bodies right now that want to violently secede. The only obstacle, according to our evidence, tells you that the reason that they are not seceding right, according to Van Diemen, is that because they're afraid about the EU, but EU not accepting them. But we all agree in today's round that if Catalonia were to secede, the EU would take them in. That's really important because they never respond to the Siraki evidence that tells you that 50% of civil secessions lead to a civil war. That's really important because at the end of the day, even if it doesn't apply specifically to Spain within Catalonia, it's going to apply to all other countries. You always prefer evidence that's not just specific to Catalonia and Spain. You prefer evidence to all secession movements because we're going to be seeing secession movements on a much broader scale. But the biggest piece of evidence that they completely drop is this Iraqi evidence that tells you that 90% of the time you're going to be seeing a violent secession and a lot of violence when you have secession. That has a couple of implications to today's round. First of all, it outweighs the magnitude of their impact on this idea of refugees. Because recognize, even if you take in a few more refugees, you're going to be starting a war is going to lead to so many more refugees, and it's going to hurt so many more people. I'd argue that death is a lot worse than refugee oppression within refugee camps. But second of all, it outweighs their case because it's a prerequisite to their case. Because if you have conflict, it means that you form more and more refugees. But third of all, it's a long-term problem. Because when you start a war and it goes on for so long, they tell you to evaluate the short term, but the short term doesn't matter. And even if we don't have a war now, if it happens in 20 years, it still lasts a lot longer.
Okay. Is everyone ready? I'm going to be starting on refugees, and then I'll do refugees weighing their argument about secession. Is everyone ready? The first and simplest way you can vote in today's round is going to be off of our first contention about refugees. Fundamentally, this is the simplest story being told in the round. We tell you that Spain doesn't want to take in refugees. From Hoffman, we tell you that political resistance is going to preclude any more refugees from coming in because of factionalization within the government. However, Catalonia really does want to take in refugees. What we tell you from Tasman is that Catalan politicians have literally said that more refugees will be taken in with independence, and they're already building the infrastructure to take them in. At that point, we are going to gain access to 17,000 refugees who are going to be taken from these really bad refugee camps into Catalonia. That's really important because the impact here is preventing mass suffering. What we tell you from Maelstrom is that this resettlement is the difference between life and death. The only response that they try to extend here is this idea that conflict is a prerequisite, but they drop the weighing that Garov gives you in summary. He tells you that not only is this very long term, which they do sort of respond to, but the problem is that it's very, very improbable. We tell you that we have a 100% probability of relocating these refugees into Catalonia, while they have a much lower probability of these conflicts happening than actually creating refugees. There are a couple of ways you can weigh this. The first is probability. Again, the probability of conflict is pretty low. The second is time frame. We say we help refugees right now. But the third and most important is going to be clarity of impact. They don't say what the conflicts they're talking about are. They don't say how bad they're going to be, and they don't say why these factions are irrationally going to go to war against their host nations. We tell you, 17,000 refugees are going to get a home 100% of the time when you affirm the resolution. But now let's go to their case, because this is the second way you can vote for us, off of the Mancini turn. The only reason and the only warrant they extend into secession is that the idea that EU legitimizes these secessions to come up. But they really mishandle the Mancini turn, which says that when you grant Catalonia independence with the EU at the table, it creates a legal precedent for the EU to regulate secession in the future. That's why he tells you the secession is going to be subject to legal and rational jurisdiction by the EU and is going to lose its evocative power. That's why he concludes that it will prompt independence movements to shift their agenda towards less disruptive objectives. That means these secession movements are pretty violent right now, but now they're going to have to face mainstream, political, legal channels rather than the violence they're talking about. At the point where they're telling you the secession movements turn to violence and they try to outweigh them long term, we are telling you this is the only long-term sustainable solution for secession ever.
Mancini. And then from you guys, it was like the complimentary in that trade turn. It was like Vaughn something.
Vin Naiman.
Yeah, Vin Naiman.
I see Tasman too.
Yeah. Pull it up.
There's some.
So I only see those two plus Tasman.
Oh, can I also see Siraki?
Yeah.
I'll get Soraka.
I don't know if this is one of the things that they mentioned. What was the evidence at the end of the case? Like you said, a new end? The upsurge in violence.
90%.
Is it Al Jazeera maybe? I'm not sure.
Do you remember the statistic attached with it? There was one card that said 50% and one that said 90%.
There was one
We
that
had-
was the 63% experience.
Yeah,
violent,
we had
I think,
50% civil war, 63% violent new recession or secessions, and then overall 90%.
Yo, she's on Mancini. My Wi-Fi's on. It's enough too.
I think this was related to Spain. It was at the very end of the case. I mean, don't worry about it.
Where is it? I'm not
Two?
sure. Sorry.
Have to.
Okay.
It's like first.
Okay. It's just the links in there.
I think it's
So,
carded.
you said you want to see Van Naiman?
Yes, please.
Here's Van Naiman. Oh, sorry.
I honestly want to see Siraki too.
You want to see Siraki, yeah?
Yeah.
Jade's getting Siraki.
Can you pull up Tasman because it's cut?
Yeah, sure. We'll just show them together since it's
Yeah.
Got it. You want to see the
and say show them say like the link for precedence is
Okay. So Mancini evidence is right here, and the link for EU precedents is the card right hand.
Okay.
This is the Soraka 90%.
sorry.
There's a
Sorry.
subtraction in there.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just gonna leave this here. This is the Taz name.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wait, which one was I? So this is Mancini. What was the
Mancini
other
is
one?
so low. What?
Oh, the other one is right there.
No, what was the one that the other one that you said?
The EU precedent's the one, just the card just right above it.
You press it.
There might be like two above.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Oh, you want this, right? Yeah. Siraki.
Oh yes.
What is it? This is Siraki.
This is Tasman.
Oh wait, did you want to see the infrastructure card or?
Yeah.
I'm good on the infrastructure part. Is this Siraki?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I grab that, please? Thank you. I am done with. Wait, do you want to see Mancini?
Yeah.
Okay. There's so many laptops. in this room.
What's the date on this? On the Mancini?
I can look.
Yeah. We can just.
I'm done with Siraki. Should I take another?
Probably. It's like, yeah. No, I already looked at this. Wait,
This is 2012.
2012? Okay.
You still want to see it?
Mancini.
Yeah,
This
it's
is-
there's no date on the document itself.
Did you pass me that, Neil? Thanks, Neil.
How do you spell Vaughn, whatever his name is?
Van
Then
Hanen. Good question.
I'm gonna just do it phonetically.
Okay.
Can I see the infrastructure card?
Yeah. Just pass the Neil.
And then if you scroll down, it like elaborates on what that sentence talks about.
Yeah. Neil.
Oh,
Sorry. Is everyone good with evidence? Okay, cool.
I'm good.
You guys are
Acton.
Acton. You guys are UNICEF. Okay.
It is a 3-0 for the affirmative.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought it was a pretty close round, but like the way a lot of the impacts ended up interacting at the end made me vote app. So to start off, I think like the refugees argument was pretty undercovered by you guys, and I think you did the classical like debate thing where you're just kind of like, okay, well this impacts my case as a prereq, this impacts my case as a prereq, and then you apply the generic block and try to get away with it. But I think that they shut that down pretty well. They do a really good job handling like the econ prereq. I think that the conflict prerequisite ends up getting like a little. I mean, like, you made the generic argument that, like, conflict in the future is going to cause it. So, I mean, that kind of worked out. But in terms of, like, the link level and the impact level of the argument, you guys, like they did, like, a really, like, every single card, like, all the links all the time, like, really good weighing on, like, probability and time frame. I think that, like, you really kind of wandered into some dangerous territory being, like, 100% versus 90%. Because I was like, yo, that's not that close. Like, well, like, that is pretty close. And so I think that was a little bit risky. But, like, I'll talk about what I did with the conflict impact at the end. But I thought that was a solid prong of offense that was weighed pretty well. So that was a good way. That was the biggest way for me to vote. And the other reason I voted AF was the Mancini turn. And the reason why the Mancini turn, because, like, when you guys read Van Heyman, right, being like, oh, it's going to, like, energize, if they enter the EU, then there's going to be, like, all these secession movements, right? And you try to turn that into offense by being like, yeah, and all of them are going to be really, really violent, which is what like Siraki and stuff like those talk about. But insofar as I buy that, like, Mancini is shifting this like legal path for secession, opens up more like rational and like legal ways and like peaceful ways for them to pursue that, then this becomes a like argument about pacifying the rest of Europe and making sure that these other secession movements don't escalate into conflict. So even independent of what I think about Catalonia, setting the precedent that there are legal and peaceful ways to proceed with secession is a pretty compelling voter for me. Here, let me just reload this. So the main thrust that I get out of the neg going into the last couple speeches is off of, like, basically for me it was like the 90% conflict card at the bottom. But first of all, I think that, like, you kind of undercover warrant extensions in the last two speeches. I think you focus too much on the stats, and part of that is because the statistics are pretty good. I was sitting here like, what the heck, like, it's like made for this topic and stuff. And I agree with you guys that it was generic, but like you stopped extending that, and I mean it didn't. I think like, well,
no, I'm shaking my head. It's not. That card is so good because, but like 3 or 4 lines down from what you actually cite, it like specifically says that there's a difference between homogenous nations, like homogenous conflicts and non-homogenous conflicts.
I will also say, like, that whole like homogenous versus heterogeneous thing sounds like the most counterintuitive thing in the world. And I don't know if I don't know. Anyway, so then this entire issue about so the 90% card. So I think that the really, really big problem for me here is that if I buy the Mancini turn that there's a shift from illegal to legal secession, I think that like all those secessions that you're talking about, those secessions shift into this kind of like peaceful, more amicable process that probably like, and they taught, and like, and that probably saw back at least a part of that. Because like part of what really confused me about Siraki is that he like kind of pushed together, he's like a bunch of types of conflict, and he's like, there's gonna be something, right? And so at least part of that is solved back by Mancini to the point where I kind of like am able to buy their weighting about probability and time frame, and I'm like, I'd rather save 17,000 people now, and then kind of like deal with the conflict later on. I do think that like everybody like each side got away with something that I thought was kind of ridiculous. So you guys got away with applying this like generic secession stuff into this, and like this is Catalonia is still like way more peaceful than like probably a lot of secessions that have happened across the globe, right? Like a lot of those times those things are violent. The second thing I thought you got like, so I just thought that like you're using a data set, and I think that Catalonia isn't in the average. And I think that you guys could have argued that, but like Catalonia isn't a generic case. Like it's been in this like quasi mode for all these years. But I think what you guys get is like you totally let them get away with like totally romanticizing what happens in Catalonia, right? And like Mancini does this. They're like, oh, if you grant Catalonia their independence, it's going to be like this like light comes into the world, and it's like oh, we have this rational path forward, and all these people in Flemings are going to be like, let's like put down the paperwork to become a country. Like Catalonia was treason. Right, and I think a lot of people in this tournament are doing this. Like at the end of the day, the Catalan government said screw the constitution, right? Like if they keep going, like it's gonna like this was like the South tried to secede from the Union, and like every history book talks about them like they were horrible for doing that. At least where I grew up. I know I'm in the North. I know like I know in the South they call it like the War of Northern Aggression, which is crazy. Anyway, like, but I mean like, and like this is the thing is that people are like, oh, like the Catalan government just wants to be like self-determined. I was like, you committed treason, right? And I think that like at the end of the day, like even if you don't incentivize violence, you incentivize treason, right? And like there's an argument to be made there that I think you just kind of got away with, being like, this is yes, the Catalan conflict, what a beacon of legal procession. Like no, like it was treason, and then you crack down on them, and there's all this other thing. So and I mean like I don't know if that would have been enough to overcome the argument, but like it was really weird sitting here and hearing that. But in the end of the day, I just went for I honestly just went on refugees and Mancini pacifying other secessions in Europe, and then like the 90% card was nullified enough that their weighing are kind of blocked.
I pretty much vote just about the exact same way. I think that like the longer I sat here and looked like through this, the more like the closer it ends up being. Just because like this is like a really good round. There's a lot of clash that's interacting with itself, like building, iterating on like what's actually happening, and I think that like you chip away at this argument more and more and more and more, and it's like not really clear that anything's changed because we're basically debating different issues every single speech, like different issues within the arguments, but like this is a very, very close round. I take issue with your Tasman card, and ultimately like that ends up like, because when I'm looking at like the probability, right, like I have a lot of components of this refugee argument that like get to this probability debate, because you stand up and you assert that this is like 100% chance, or like that if I vote app, I 100% save 17,000 refugees. Okay, so like the Tasman card coupled with the infrastructure card doesn't really give me that impression, because the Tasman card is like, it says in the two lines, like the sentence or two before the one that you quote, it's like that most of the people are walking for this reason, but these politicians used the like separatist or secession movement to like jump onto the refugee crisis or vice versa or something. It was like weird. Okay. And it's like they call into question in rebuttal, like this isn't the majority of the government that's saying like we need to take in more refugees. They're saying like it's only like a couple politicians, and based on the Tasman card, like it's not really clear what that is actually, like who is saying it or what their agendas are. Like the Tasman card itself is calling that into question, and I think you maybe should have gone harder for that, because it really would have called the question of the probability of this argument. It really would have called that into question for me, because with the infrastructure card, it's just the only real indication I get that Catalonia is actually like uniquely able to do this is that they have the most places available for like the most different houses available, and it doesn't say why that is. It doesn't say like anything about that, and it just like the card is about them appealing the central government to take in more refugees. They're not like actually explicitly saying we need to take more refugees because like Spain isn't. It's just could because we can.
Yeah.
And I think that like the more that gets chipped away from the probability, the like less likely I am to just like cleanly vote off of refugees. So I would just be careful. Ultimately, I think that like you do encounter an issue with the military arc in that you don't really provide me with like the incentive necessary for the military buildup to materialize in a manner that would like preclude any of the defense on the secessionist impacts. That probably didn't make sense because they argue in rebuttal that like it would take a long time to build up the military. And with this turn that they have on the EU, where they're like, we all agree that they're going to be that they're going to get into the EU, which means that there's like the legal precedent component. Like by the time the military is built up and conflict could happen, it's like difficult for me to like on scope or time frame really like interpret where these impacts, like when these impacts are going to materialize in the time frame extrapolating outwards. So the easiest path to the ballot for me is just the probability argument out of refugees.